Mike Boyd, welcome to the show. Excited to do this.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad we could finally do it.
I think it's tomorrow where you're at. He's from Australia. We're all here in the States, but I think it's tomorrow. How's tomorrow going?
Right, tomorrow is fantastic. I have to tell you, the future is bright. You're going to love it. Right?
That is the perfect way to start this conversation. Let's set the stage with just a little bit about your background. You're a very accomplished entrepreneur and businessman. We'll talk a little bit about that, but we're going to talk a lot about where you've focused a lot of your energy in recent years, which I find fascinating around multi-generational wealth and businesses. But before we get into all that, let's talk about you for a bit. What kind of got you into business? And let's talk about your business background.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity. I guess I would describe myself as always being an entrepreneur. My story didn't start with a lemonade stand, but instead started selling lost golf balls that I had fished out of the creek at the age of, I think it was 11. And, progressing from there, I was the kid that couldn't help himself with starting multiple businesses during high school and then, really struggling to attend university because I was too busy getting some real world street smarts trying to outsmart the professors doing real world business. So, a little bit of a rebellious streak, but also just lots of failures, lots of attempts, lots of business building. And most of them were great lessons. A couple of them clicked and we had some great fun. So, I guess to give you a couple of highlights, I remember when I was 14, I had my parents driving me around to doctors' offices and other sort of professional waiting rooms because I was cleaning their aquariums with my little startup business called Fishy Fitness, which was lots of fun, right? So you probably just lost a bunch of listeners there. I'm sorry, but that was an absolute disaster. I couldn't get myself around. I'm asking my mum to drive me around, carrying my bucket and fish nets and chemicals and things like that, but it was one of these opportunities to follow something I was interested and passionate about at the time, knew a fair bit about, and I thought I could quit my job at the local pet shop after school and instead take the clients and service them privately with my little business. So, that lasted a few months and learned some lessons. But we progressed into, when I went through university, ended up running a reasonably successful and a lot of fun, a keg hire business, which, might sound a little odd to all of your listeners in the States, but here in Australia, it wasn't common to have a keg party in college. It's not something that you could do easily. And so after seeing it in, the great American movies, I thought that's exactly what I want for my 18th. In Australia, you can drink at 18. So that's sort of the big coming of age party where everyone drinks a lot and has a great party. And I tried to hire a keg and the equipment to dispense it for my 18th and failed. And I was so frustrated that I set about trying to solve this problem. I thought, if I've got this problem, other people have to have it too. So long story short, I begged, borrowed, and stealed and got a loan from Dad. I think it was $5,000 with the promise that I wouldn't quit my part-time job because he knew I was going to fail and he wanted to get his money back. And I used those few $1,000s to order in some equipment from the US, the dispensing gear. Ultimately did some deals with the local, pubs and clubs and things and ended up making a heap of cash, having a lot of fun through university days. We just exclusively did beer kegs for 18th and 21st birthday parties, ran it for the whole time I was in uni and then sold it to a mate and moved on to digital ventures. So it's been a wild ride.
I love it. And let's talk for just a second. You've lived in Singapore, I believe. You've kind of lived internationally, obviously well-traveled internationally. What brought you out of Australia, and have you done business outside of your home country?
Yeah, absolutely. So quite a global citizen, and that's something that I work actively for. I love being worldly and well-traveled. The thing that originally had me traveling quite a bit was one of the companies that I still own and run today. So we're sort of going to do a bit of a story arc here and accelerate to present day where I run a group of digital companies. And one of those companies is a large car rental comparison website called Vroom. So in the Southern Hemisphere, we're the largest at what we do. We work with the big guys like Hertz, Avis, Budget, Enterprise. we compare prices and availability, and people book through us. We're an online travel agency. And naturally, being in the travel industry, your partners, clients, customers, and even employees are dotted all around the world. So I had the opportunity to travel to some incredible places around the world. I was getting into the UK and Europe sort of 3 or 4 times a year. I was getting into the US usually 2 to 3 times a year, and all across Asia. Asia Pacific still being our biggest market. But over the last 8 years, I've spent time living in the Philippines, in Hong Kong, and in Singapore, and just recently returned home to Australia with my young family. And it's been a remarkable experience. I love to learn from other cultures and different ways of doing business around the world.
All right, so we're gonna actually drill down on this for a bit. So you have cleaned fish tanks, you've provided kegs, you've compared rental car services, and now are a travel agency. One theme I'm kind of picking up on is you truly are an entrepreneur's entrepreneur. You see an opportunity, you start a business. And chronologically, the previous business kind of had nothing to do with the next one. How did you get into that current business, vroom, vroom, vroom? And then I actually want to talk about what you're seeing in the world today from the data that you see, how people are traveling. But let's start with, how did you get into this one? And this seems like a really big company.
Yeah, look, this is quite an established company. It's been around 21 years. We're a market leader. We do good volume, make good money. But the way I got into it was actually, if I go back to the keg hire story, and I'll skip a couple of steps, but connect the dots for you. The way we actually built that party hire company was exclusively through SEO and social media. And if we're going back sort of 12, 15 years, that was very new, very cutting edge, very different. But to us, growing up as digital natives, it just made perfect sense. If we wanted to connect with other 17 and 18-year-olds that were planning parties for their birthday, we found them on Facebook, and we'd just transitioned off MySpace, and Twitter was a very fledgling thing. And so we were very attuned to guerrilla marketing. Every time we'd host a party, one of the things that we would do as a freebie was offer to send a photographer to the party for an hour and take some great photos of the party. Then we would post them on Facebook with our watermarked logo. So everyone that was at the party got tagged in the photos on Facebook. They'd spread across the network, and everyone knew the name of our company who provided the kegs and we did frozen daiquiri machines and things like that as well. So, it just spread, and we never spent a cent on advertising. The other thing that we did when I was first, borrowed that money to order the equipment in, and I was still speculating as to whether or not there was a business here, I started trying to teach myself to build a little HTML website. And I had built half of a website. I owned, keghire.cityname.com, and went off on my first overseas backpacking holiday as I was 18, right? I'd just missed out. I hadn't had a keg party. I was all upset. I went overseas before starting university, and I started getting all these random emails when I checked in at an internet cafe. And there was people saying, hey, can I get a keg this weekend? How much is a keg? Can I rent a keg? And it was just so bizarre. And quickly figured out that our half-built webpage, which was still an idea, ranked number 1 in Google for keg hire city name. And so we were getting all of this free inquiry. There genuinely was a market, as I thought there had been. And so when I got back from my holiday, we sort of hit the accelerator and built out that business and proceeded to have a lot of fun. So that exposed me to the power of digital marketing, digital media. And then ultimately, I formed a nonprofit group that was for entrepreneurs, because I was struggling to find my tribe, my group of people. The group that I went to school and university with didn't really get me, as I was a weird entrepreneur type. And so I started a monthly meetup for other entrepreneurs to sort of self-select and find people like me. And from that meetup, I ultimately met someone that was involved in this vroom, vroom, vroom business, and later was asked to get involved and sort of help them turn it around. And that was 11 years ago, and I've since bought them out of the business and run it today with one other family.
That is so interesting. This is the most American thing I can say about your keg for hire business. But do you remember that YouTube video of the Australian party kid that had like dyed hair and the glasses, and he was a viral sensation? Did you provide the keg for that party?
I wish.
Okay.
I wish.
Johnny, you got to look it up. It's probably past your time, but anyway,
bright yellow sunglasses on or something, and refused to take them off when he was interviewed the next day when the police had shut down his party.
Oh, I love it. I've seen that video so many times. What is this is just interesting. So your Vroom 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 is it's a travel agency. It's comparing car rentals. You kind of through that probably get data that are leading indicators on the pulse of the world. You mind sharing just what's going on? What are you seeing? Is it ramping up? Is it flat? I'm not very versed in that side of the world except for what I hear over here. What's going on over there?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, Chris. We do get some leading indicators, and it's funny because the data has actually flipped in terms of the order of events. And what I mean by that is because we're a travel agency that just focuses on ground transportation, right? We do cars, motorhomes, RVs, car parking, we do insurance, but it's all ground transport. We're not doing airfares, we're not doing hotels. What typically happens is we're an afterthought. If someone's booking a holiday, they often book their flights first, their hotels second, and then maybe think of a car rental much closer to the date. Potentially, they book a package with a travel agency with everything rolled all into one at the beginning. But we've always been an afterthought. What's happened now is because there's a global shortage with the supply chain issues, there's a global shortage of cars, and most car rental companies defleeted quite significantly throughout the pandemic. There are not enough cars. And so, at the time that we're recording this, prices for cars are incredibly high, the highest they've ever been. Supply is severely constrained. And we've found that people are starting to book their car rental first and lock that in, and then contemplate hotels and flights to backfill the trip. And so that's been a really interesting thing that's really flipped our data model on its head. But to speak more generally about what we're seeing in terms of people getting out there again, it's been an incredibly difficult 2 years, as you can imagine. When people can't travel because borders are closed, there is just literally nothing you can do operationally as a travel business except sort of shut down, hibernate, and rethink the business model and try and keep your best people engaged while waiting for things to open up. And that's what we've done. It's what we've done successfully. We ended up absorbing a couple of competitors and things throughout the pandemic that didn't have the balance sheet to ride it through. Adversity always creates opportunity. But now we're seeing the pent-up demand. So people are coming out and they're really keen to travel, whether that's domestically or internationally. They've got savings. There's plenty of cash. They're balking to some extent at the high prices, but they're still spending because they've missed out for a couple of years on the holiday. They want to spend on it now. But our biggest challenge is supply. We would be making a lot more money and a lot more volume in terms of bookings had we had more cars available at the moment. And I really think that's going to be a constraint, well into 2023, possibly 24. It's quite a widespread shock.
Interesting. Super interesting. Is that business Australian based?
Yes, it is.
And again, a little bit off topic, but did Australia provide like a PPP program like they did in America, some type of government assistance for businesses to kind of carry through the pandemic?
Yes, but not to the same extent.
Yep.
So, I have to give credit. There was some of that. It certainly helped more businesses than others. For our business, because we're global and have such a global footprint of employees, it was only available to our Australian employees, of course.
Yep.
And we had a lot of remote workforce, contractors. We have a back office in Manila. We have employees in Europe and the States that work remotely for us there to cover time zones and things like that. And there was no help whatsoever for that because those employees tended to fall into a category where they were either working for a multinational, so they didn't qualify for something locally in the States, or, the Australians qualified for something, but it was a small slither of what our global workforce looked like. And so, we got a small benefit, but it wasn't anything significant. We only got through based on our balance sheet.
Yeah. Well, kudos to you, man. It's a big pat on the back to all the entrepreneurs out there that have made it through the last couple of years. And like you said, there's opportunity, and I think we can all say we're all better off for having gone through it. Wouldn't have wanted to go through it, but we've learned lessons that I don't think we ever thought we'd learn.
Absolutely.
All right.
Let's hope it's behind us.
Yeah. One of the thing that, has really captivated me about what you've done, and you have made a business, a podcast, kind of a brand called The Business of Family. Let's just start. Will you just describe what that is and what it means to you and what you're trying to get out of it?
Look, you can interpret the business of family lots of ways, but one way I love to talk about it is this sort of, if you imagine a continuum, and on one side you've got family businesses, and on the other side you've got business families. I love to focus on the business families. What does it take to build a family that borrows some of the intellect, organization, culture, values from some of the best businesses in the world in order to organize and build amazing family relationships, build generational assets together, and have a lot of fun? So I love to explore the business of family, where I spend a lot of time interviewing business families who typically have an interest in or are already living a generational aspect of their family. It could, in some instances, be a single family business that's been around for 3 generations, or for me, more interestingly, because I'm an entrepreneur and I've got a lot of interests and a portfolio of companies that I own and operate, I love exploring business families that might have more than one operating company, then set up a family office, have an annual family retreat, might organize themselves around a family constitution or charter, sit down together and discuss what their family's vision is and their values. It's bringing governance to the family, which is, I think, a topic that's not often discussed. There's something that you can go very deep on for those that are in this space. You can really go deep if you get interested in this space, but it's also something that not a lot of people understand or even aware of. And I guess the final point I'll make on it is the reason why that I find it incredibly fascinating is because most in the audience will have heard a similar proverb to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, which effectively means the first generation makes it, the second generation builds it, expands it, maintains it, and usually by the third generation, they lose it. And there's all sorts of sort of stories and reasons why. But shirt sleeves in 3 generations is observed all around the world. It's not a US thing. It's not an Australian thing. It's not an Asian thing. In fact, in China, they say rice paddies to rice paddies in 3 generations. The Irish say potatoes, all sorts of different adages around the world. And the rule holds true. It's partly because founders are wired one way. Founding generation, you come to the country with $5 in your pocket and you have to make something out of adversity, and you build. And then the second generation grows up modeling the first generation. They see some of the hard work. They probably grew up with not much. And then maybe as they came into adult age or later adult age, they ended up becoming wealthy because the first generation built something that over their lifetimes generated some wealth. Second generation saw some hard work and then ultimately enjoyed the spoils of that. The third generation, the grandkids, came along. They didn't see any of the hard work necessarily. They just grew up in relative abundance compared to the first and second gen. They don't have the value system or understanding necessarily in order to maintain that wealth, manage that wealth, stick together with their relationships and bonds. And usually by the fourth generation, the wealth is lost, dissipated, and the fourth generation starts again. That's the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves. So I love studying this and finding the exceptions to the rule. There are families out there who fight against these statistics, and the statistics are extreme. 30% successfully passed to the second gen, something like 3 or 4% successfully passed to the third gen, and those that successfully passed to the fourth generation and beyond are a rounding error. So I love to study those extreme exceptions to that rule to understand how people ultimately perpetuate their businesses, their wealth, and their relationships.
You just set the stage for an amazing conversation that we're about to have. Before we dive into it, man, that was so great. Thank you for that. Why are you interested in this? Is this something that spawned from your family? Is it something you wish you had in your family? Like, how does this become the thing that you're going to pour a lot of time into?
Look, it's a great question. As an entrepreneur, I've always been wired for the long term. So I didn't realize it at the time, but if I sort of go back thinking about my experience over the last couple of decades, I've always adopted naturally family business style values. And what are they? They tend to be building enduring ventures, having employees that work with us and stay with us sometimes for a decade or more, being strong contributors to our community. In effect, being a pillar. We're not here to build a company that's here for a year or two and quickly flip it through private equity or VC and move on. We're not trying to shoot the lights out and be a rocket ship or a unicorn or anything like that. We're trying to build something that's stable, sustainable, and going to be here for the very long term. That is just purely my value system. I've always been wired that way. I love to, as Naval would say, play long-term games with long-term people. I love that phrase. He sort of articulates it better than anyone. And so I set out to try and solve for this because I admired the families who had done it. You read the biographies, you read the books, or you see people in your community. And it was always stood out to me when you met adult children or young adult children of very successful business families who seem to have it together, right?
Yeah.
Down under, we say, they seem to have their shit together.
Yeah.
I hope I can say that on your podcast.
You can say that.
Because it's the exception, right? You expect to see spoiled kids, spoiled brats, right? The money's ruined them. That's the typical adage we see in the media. It's what's amplified. Wealth spoils. Well, in fact, wealth can also amplify. It can amplify the good, the positive, and you can have incredible impact. And I'm not just talking about people that get rich and give it all away through philanthropy. I think it's incredible that families can build wealth, build stronger relationships with each other, and get to the third or fourth generation and be a learning organization that is ultimately contributing to society for centuries and really heavily investing in what we call human capital, the next generation. They're doing things with intention. So we can dive into all the detail you like, but these families don't get to the fourth generation by accident. They have to fight these statistics using governance practices and doing things very intentionally. They set up education funds for the grandkids and the great-grandkids. They create mentorship opportunities through their business network. They gather around family meetings and teach some of the value systems and storytelling from the elders. It's all very, very intentional. So to get back to your question as to why I'm passionate and excited about this is because I want to do that.
Yeah.
I'm a founder and first generation. I do not come from a what I would consider a multi-generational wealthy family, but I hope to be the founding generation of one. And I have young kids, I think similar age to yours, Chris. And so it's quite unusual for me to be in a position where I'm deep into this topic and exploring this myself. But I've actually been exploring this area for a good part of 15 years, laying the foundation for my family enterprise, recording our history, recording our values, documenting our family meetings, to do this with intention so that effectively we're leaving breadcrumbs for the next generation to follow.
Oh, man. All right. Here we go. So it's fair to say, I think the dumbest question I could maybe ask of the day is, in order to do this successfully, and let's kind of pretend that this conversation is about beating the statistics and getting to call it the fourth generation and beyond, even though even getting to the third generation really is beating the odds. In everything that you've learned, none of this can really happen by accident. Is it fair to say that everybody that you've seen successfully accomplish this has done it with a lot of purpose, effort, just like they've put into their business, they put into their family? Or have you seen any outliers where it just kind of magically happened and nobody knew how it happened?
It's a great question. The short answer is it's possible to stumble into the third generation by accident.
Yep.
It's very rare to see anything beyond that. Anything beyond that is very intentional. And usually by the time you see a third generation family who got there by accident, there has been some sort of pruning event, which, whether intentional or otherwise, has increased the odds of them getting that far. And here's what I mean by that. The first generation passed to the second generation, and instead of the second generation being 4 siblings, it was 1. And so it passed through one set of hands, and the third generation then inherited it. That makes it a whole lot easier. Whereas if you have a first generation and your second generation is, say, 6 adult children, there's a lot more people to divide the wealth between, a lot more people that have to get along to unite around a single vision in order to perpetuate the wealth. And so it does depend a little bit on family dynamics and how big the family is. But usually by the third generation, there's enough cousins, there's enough grandkids that there's a reason why things fall apart at that level. The statistics aren't just statistics. There is actually a reason why things break. And that reason typically is because the family grows faster than the business. The family grows faster than the business. So if you imagine a family tree diagram, you start with a founding set of parents. They have 4 adult children. Those 4 adult children each have 2 children each, right? So we're now at 8 grandchildren. By the time you get to that level, you've got 4 distinct adult children families with their own children. You've got 4 spouses who have married in, male or female. You've got a different set of value system. They're all probably living different ways. If everyone thinks of their brother or sister in the audience now and appreciates the differences between yourself and your brothers and sisters, and then imagine trying to get 4 of you to get along around one united vision, do that to the third generation, and then imagine what happens when you get to the 4th generation. You've now got 8 grandchildren who all potentially marry or partner, and then have between 2 and 4 kids each. The family grows faster than the business. And so if you start with just one pot of wealth, one source of wealth, maybe it's a single family business or maybe a single family investment, by the time you get to the 3rd generation, there are too many mouths to feed. So even though you started wealthy in the 1st generation, by the time you divide it by 8 grandchildren and 4 adults, you've got 12 people there. By the time you divide it into 12 pieces, no one's wealthy anymore. Maybe they've had their college paid for and that's about it.
Yep.
And so we talk about families being transported into wealth or transported out of wealth. And by definition, because families grow so quickly, unless you're topping that up, unless you're encouraging entrepreneurship and raising great kids and teaching values and trying to keep some of that wealth together rather than dividing it in pieces, then the natural law just simply shows that over time, the wealth erodes unless you intentionally work to keep it together.
I kind of put myself in your camp in the founder family, so we'll spend some time there. But before I dive back into that, if at the 3rd generation things kind of die, is it fair to say that there's chance in the 4th generation for a new kind of rebirth of the founder to arrive? Or how long does it take for the founder generation to show back up in the family, if at all?
So absolutely yes. And the founder generation can show up at any time. But typically we say shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations because you have to start rebuilding in the 4th generation. It doesn't mean that families necessarily do, but I have seen examples where someone who would otherwise be 4th or 5th generation today speaks to me about how they lost the family legacy. They lost the legacy wealth because there was breakdown relationships in the 3rd generation. They got relatively little or absolutely nothing, but they saw some of it play out and they're determined to do things differently. And instead, as a 4th generation member, they now see themselves as a founder and they're setting out to sort of create an initial pot of capital again, if we're using financial terms. So it does happen. And it happens quite often, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have to show up in the 4th generation. You might go multiple generations before a founder shows up again.
Yep. And it's fair to say, and I think you already said it, but I'm just repeating, obviously the less people involved in the family, the greater the odds of a successful continuum transfer. And that's just by way of numbers, by way of emotions. You have more characters involved, but we can kind of set the stage with, regardless of how great your business is and how great your family is, the more people that you reproduce in the family, the odds continue to stack against you, no matter how great things are.
Kind of.
Okay.
So there again, yeah, this is a really great question. I'll try not to get too complex too quickly here, but there is, again, it's a continuum. And on 2 ends of the continuum is where it's important and where you can be successful. The middle bit is where it all gets lost. So you described one end of that. And one end of that is where there is fewer family members involved, fewer relationships to manage, fewer things can go wrong. Therefore, the task is perhaps a little bit easier. And I mentioned the word pruning earlier. Some families perpetuate their wealth successfully into the 3rd and 4th generation because they pruned the family tree. And I don't mean that in an aggressive way, but just as an example, they pruned the family tree by one branch buying out the other. Or, unfortunately, one sibling passed away, or one sibling was not capable or otherwise. And so that happens quite a bit as well. Families that say get to the second generation, there's 3 children, 2 of them don't work in the business. They've got professional or academic careers. They have their own life and they're very happy. And there's one child who, has grown up working in the business with mum and dad, or, effectively being the mentee. They've worked in it for 20 years and they're the natural successor. There's all sorts of friction that happens in that environment because the other 2 adult siblings who aren't involved in the business might have an equal share in the inheritance, right? They might have 33% each, and then there's someone in it that's actually running it day to day, and they've also got 33. And so what often happens there, either they clash, can't get along, and it falls apart and the wealth is lost, or the person that's running the business raises outside capital and buys out the 2 siblings who aren't involved, and continues to perpetuate the legacy by pruning the tree back to a single family. And if that happens in the 3rd generation, it almost resets the clock and they get to the 4th. And then the challenge is, how do you hold on to it in the 5th? That's one end of the continuum.
Okay.
I'll give you 30 seconds on the other end.
Go as long as you want.
Far more complex.
Okay.
The other end of the spectrum is when you have very large family enterprises, and I'm talking 100+ members, sometimes 500+ members. You're multi-generational. The family tree has grown enormously and you've managed to keep it together for generations, usually because there's great governance in place and you've done it intentionally. When you get to that level, you've effectively jumped the gap and you have such a sophisticated structure in place that the family enterprise, and I use this sort of umbrella term, family enterprise, which might incorporate a group of operating businesses, investments, a family office, a family council, all sorts of things like that. The family enterprise is now so large and so well managed, it's a run by a family council, which is like a board of directors, that it's actually easier to some extent to operate at that level with 100+ family members because it operates more like a well-run public company than a small private company where we're trying to get along with 2 or 3 other people. It's moving away from individual egos, individual agendas, and instead saying we are now stewards of what we have built in prior generations. We're looking after this temporarily, trying to improve it and pass it on in better shape to the next generation. So the hard work is in the middle and getting from one end of the spectrum to the other.
And on that end of the spectrum where it's starting to run almost like a true business, like you said, where there's not really egos and it's for the mission of you, if you will, of the family. Is it usually the family still making the decisions, or have they put some type of third party or some other non-biased party, maybe not is in charge of everything, but is involved in helping kind of run that organization? Or is it usually still within the family?
Look, when you get to that size, you've always got advisors and professionals and coaches and things like that that have helped you learn the mechanisms. But typically, these family enterprises are still very much family run or family stewarded. And so what that looks like from a governance perspective is the family usually stack the board. I've seen one example where it was nearly 100% independent director governed with one family chairman. That was very unusual and also very successful. But most of them you will see, like I interviewed a family recently on the podcast. They were a US family, 7th generation, incredible story. And they have 500 individual family shareholders and participants in their family enterprise. We talk about the family tree growing faster than the enterprise, 500 people, right? So they have a family council, which, as I said, is like a board of directors, and people are elected to that family council and serve terms, much like you would as a director. And so there is a governance process, there is a constitution, there's a set of values, there's a strategy document, but it's all planning for the family. And that family council sets out what's the vision that we're aiming for, how we're going to achieve it over the next 3 to 5, which is a business term, but really what they're actually planning is how we're going to achieve it over the next 30 to 50 to 100 years. And that's the other key distinction in these family enterprises, the very long-term nature in planning. So, it's fascinating to see at the more sophisticated end how these families operate, how they elect their family council members, and how it's no longer about individual ownership or inheritance, Instead, it's a collective effort to try and keep the assets and the family together and steward it in good shape to the next gen.
Unbelievable. All right, kind of going back to the other end of the spectrum. Let's spend just a little bit of time on clashing. You kind of mentioned one where, let's just pretend there's that situation. Maybe there's 3 kids, 2 aren't going to work in the business. One's the clear successor. And there's one scenario where he went and raised capital, or she went and raised capital and bought out the other 2. What are the mechanisms that you've seen work or not work when a clash happens?
That's a great question. So getting into family dynamics and trying to understand the relationships at play, the term is, if you've met one family business or one family enterprise, then you have met one family enterprise. They are all unique.
Yeah.
So you can bring all of the rules and experience that you like, and then you walk into a room and you see siblings fighting, and it's based on, something that happened in their teen years that they're still resentful about, and good luck undoing that. And so it's hard work. It's hard work, which is why, to sort of jump a step here, starting in the founding generation or the second generation, putting this sort of philosophy in place makes it a whole lot easier. Because if the third gen doesn't have an expectation to inherit and that 33% is theirs, then you avoid that argument in the first place. Instead, it's a conversation about, what are we going to do rather than what am I going to do?
Yeah.
So what works? Pruning the family tree, as I said before, buying one out. If siblings really can't get along, some will just stay the course, and many do to their detriment. They stay the course and say, well, I don't want to give up the legacy that I've inherited from my parents or my grandparents. I really need to keep this business alive, but they've got all of this family infighting and relationship trouble. They can't get along. They're really resentful that they're making all this money for their non-participating shareholders. They're not on the board. They don't take any risk. They don't make any decisions. They're not working the hours. And this one individual is. And so sometimes that goes on for years until it finally blows up. What often happens is that the health of the business or the enterprise, the underlying investment, suffers, right? Because it becomes a giant distraction, as you can imagine. Why would I want to invest as much as I possibly can in this when 66% of it is owned by my siblings who couldn't care less?
Yeah.
And so sometimes you see siblings intentionally nosedive the enterprise, and takes a turn for the worse, and say, well, if I can't do this the way I want, I'm going to destroy it for everyone. Other times that wealth gets destroyed anyway, just because they're distracted and mismanaging. And then you also see succession, when succession is in a bind, that's when you also see exits, right? So that's where we say, look, we can't get along. We can't agree how to steward the wealth in the asset that we have currently. Let's liquidate everything.
Yeah.
And that's probably what happens more often. And that's where, you see that most often in the third generation. First generation founded it. They had skills, knowledge, networks, understanding. Second generation saw some of that growing up sometimes, and at least had an appreciation for what it took to build it. Third generation gets it, and they're perhaps a little bit befuddled and say, one, I don't want to work as hard as grandpa did, or I don't know how to, or the world has changed and it's no longer relevant. Just give me my share.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go and have my own life and do my own thing. I value the legacy, but I want to live my own thing, which is perfectly okay as well. And that's why most wealth gets divided up in the third gen if it's not lost beforehand.
Is it fair to say from first to second gen that the intention to move the asset, let's call it the operating business, down the lineage, is that usually coming from the founder hoping that it goes to the second, or is it coming from the second hoping that the first will give it to them? You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's normally always the founder wanting to see their legacy continue, wanting to see their life's work continue. And the issues arise when the second gen says, hey, look, this is cool and all, but I want to live my own life.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes you have that and you'll have a clash. Other times, you will have someone who says, there's a great opportunity. I grew up working in the business. I love it. I learned everything from dad, and now he won't let go.
Yeah.
He won't get out of the way. He's 82 years old and won't get out of the way. Succession time was 12 years ago. He needs to retire. He needs to slow down. His health's not great. Like, this plays out countless times. And so the second gen often wrestles for control, and it's the second gen that reaches out for help in most circumstances, if it's not for the matriarch of the family. So when you talk, and please forgive me, I'm speaking in vast generalizations,
right?
Because as I said, every family is unique, but you do see this play out quite often, that the second gen reaches out to some sort of advisor or specialist in the field, or they start researching family governance or multi-generational wealth because they say, look, someone else has made it to the fifth generation. I'm only second. Dad won't let go. Let me pick up a book and try and figure out how to do this stuff. What conversation do I have with him? How do I broach this topic? How do we talk about succession? And so we see the second gen show up most often. We also see matriarchs, typically, could be the patriarch, but matriarchs typically, who tend to be the glue in a family enterprise, hate to see the clash between the founding gen and the second gen, or hate to see the clash between different members of the second generation because they're not getting along, and how do we get these siblings? And so oftentimes the matriarch will reach out and say, how do we keep the family together?
Yep.
The business is important, the wealth's important, but how do we keep the family together? And that's where they come into this process as well.
All right. How many kids do you have?
2.
Okay. Well, I have 2. I have a third, but let's just assume let's just say 2-3 kid family. What are the things, actually, I don't even think this question, it really matters, but I'm speaking more to you and what you've learned. What are best practices for first generations families to do if their hope and desire is to obviously raise great kids that are functioning members of society, but more than that want to take over the business and actually do it really well? One of the biggest parenting tips I've gotten over time is like, don't force things on your kids. The more things you force on them, the more they actually probably won't want them. You have to let them want in. So you've talked to some of the greatest families across the globe. What are the key things that you've picked up on that would say, if parents do this, the odds that their kids can not only take over the business, but be successful with it? These parents have done this for those kids.
Great question. There's about 15 answers I could give you, so let me try and pick 2. The challenge is, to answer specifically about my situation, I came into considerable wealth or relative wealth for my circumstances in my 20s, building technology companies. Mm-hmm. And I was transported from one world to another, from average middle class to, wow, I'm wealthy. What do I do? And that was just before I started having kids, and then ultimately had kids. And so I felt the pressure and the panic of all I've ever heard is raising great kids, wealth spoils them. You yep. see the rich kids, the bad stories in the media and everything else because it gets clicks. And so I set out to try and research how to not do that. And then, of course, you hear all the stories about family businesses where it's an expectation that the next generation takes over. And of course, I've interviewed families from all around the world, Asia, Latin America, Europe, and the US. And you see that in different cultures more so. There's still an expectation in some cultures that the eldest son inherits everything and will perpetuate the legacy and has no choice. That person doesn't decide their life. The patriarch has already decided it. And, so I've researched lots and lots of different families, but you asked specifically about what can founders do. And I think all I can offer you is my perspective.
Yep.
And my perspective and desire for my family is not to force anything on my kids, but instead to provide them with outsized learning opportunities and lots of love. Because what I most want to avoid is the wealth amplifying negatives and blowing up the family. I would much prefer to have family relationships intact than the wealth. If I can pull off both, then that is a great success. So from my family enterprise perspective, you'll remember at the very beginning of the conversation, I said, I like to focus on business families rather than family business. So rather than focusing on one single operating asset, which it has an expectation that the next gen will pick up, I like to think of it in terms of a collection of values, assets, vision, understanding, learning, intellectual property, networks. There's so many intangibles that are valuable as well. And you can think of this in business terms or family terms. So for my kids, they will grow up with plenty of opportunity to get exposure to lots of different industries, because as an entrepreneur, I have investments in lots of different industries and have built businesses in different parts of the world. But they will have access to an incredible network of friends, colleagues, partners around the world where they can mentor. They can go on summer camps stay in Switzerland and learn about chocolate making, because we have a family over there that we're friends with. That's a great thing to do when you're 11, and they're going to ski amazing slopes around the world. They're going to learn languages. They're going to sit and eat, great hot pot in hawker centers in Asia because we spent time there. I want to expose them to these things. And from a family enterprise perspective, yes, there's wealth. Yes, there's a family office. Yes, there's operating businesses. But when it comes to the enterprise, it's more about who are we as a family? What are the collective assets that we are stewarding to the next generation? And how do we do that? And that's where you get into the all-important how. So a big part of family governance is similar to business. You often start with a guiding vision from the founding generation, which, I have one for my family. We have family value system, which is important for parents too, because we often have a set of values that we want to teach our kids anyway. Now let's be intentional about it and write it down. So in the founding generation, the value system and the vision was discussed and decided upon between my wife and I. As the kids get older, it may evolve because they'll have an opinion and perspective too, and we might update it. And as the kids get to an age-appropriate level, they start getting involved in the family meetings. So typically when you get into a sophisticated governance structure, a family will get together for an annual retreat, often called a family assembly, once a year, and they'll often go off-site. It's like a corporate retreat, but instead, we as a family, we go skiing somewhere interesting in the world, and then we host our family meeting. And we'll reflect on the year, and we'll talk about our goals and what we achieved and what didn't go well, what we want to improve. But also we have a look at all of the forms of capital and assets in the family and discuss those. One of the key parts of this that I talk about on my podcast and some of the people I've interviewed is this concept of the 5 capitals. So there's an amazing author who wrote a book called Family Wealth. I recommend it to everyone. It's by a guy called Jay Hughes Jr. And Jay's about 80 years old now. He's sort of the grandfather of this space. And he really revolutionized the ways of thinking around family capital. And he divided it into 5 capitals. So oftentimes when we talk about generational wealth and families of wealth, we only think of the money. But when families get really intentional about stewarding their assets, their wealth, their capital to the next generation, there's 5 capitals: human capital, intellectual capital, social capital, spiritual capital, financial capital. And as a family, we model all of those. Every time we have a meeting, we review the 5 capitals. We talk about what's important to us, how we're investing in each of them. To give you a really quick example, celebrating the human capital could be the birth of a new baby. It could be someone that's joined the family, or it could be a new spouse that's married into the family, because we're now a bit bigger and we're onto the 3rd generation and we're welcoming the new human capital into the family. Intellectual capital is how we actually building this family enterprise into a learning organization, much like we might do in a corporate setting. How are we educating the next generation? Are we setting aside an education fund to send the kids through great schools and colleges? Are we doing the same thing for the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren? How are we stewarding that financial capital to help invest in our intellectual capital of the next generation? The spiritual capital, from a faith perspective, it varies around the world. It's a combination of culture, faith, religion, but also oftentimes the family has a spirit, a unique fabric of its own that comes from its storytelling from the elders as well. Social capital could be philanthropy, could be the networks, could be the contribution to community and society, and how families are held together. And financial capital takes the form of a family office or a collection of investments or operating assets. And so actually putting frameworks around these things is what helps families operate with intention and do this quite successfully.
When is the best time? And again, I know I'm asking you questions that the answer is, lots of things, but when's the best time to start telling, we'll keep talking about you. You became wealthy in your 20s. You're not much older than I am. I don't know if you are older than I think you're a little bit older than I am. I'm 35. How old are you?
35.
Okay. Boom, baby. 1987. What a great year. I was 87. Were you 87?
Yeah, I was.
Okay.
I was. And I'm living in the future, remember, Chris? So
and your day, I know.
It's still bright.
The future is still bright. And the past
Yep.
still looks good from back here. Just letting you know. Your kids are pretty young. So
Yep.
when is the right time to start telling your children that you're wealthy and that that you have money? I think I've seen it handled lots of ways where people are really transparent. I've seen it in ways where they're not very transparent, but the vibe and the culture is that we're wealthy and we're wealthy, but you don't know how much. In all of your findings, is there a right time or age to start telling your children, there is a pool of money that's growing that's larger than most? And then we'll talk about, once you answer that, what happens after you disclose that to them.
Yeah, so I err towards transparency, and of course it's different in different cultures, but I err towards transparency because if you're running this model of operating as stewards rather than inheritors, it doesn't really matter how big the bank account is or the size of the assets, because part of the message of being a steward is this is not yours. This is yours to take care of. You have a great responsibility. One day you will need to steward this to your kids and grandkids. And so it completely shifts the conversation. Rather than saying, yes, we're wealthy, we're wealthier than most, and I'm not sure whether or not I broach this conversation with you when you're 10 or 20 or 30 or if ever, and one day you're going to inherit a chunk of it and you're going to be wealthy. You sort of remove all expectations around that and entitlement around that, because the entitlement is what destroys kids of wealth.
Yep.
So instead you involve them as early as possible in operating and contributing to the family enterprise. You invite the kids to the family meeting. You give them projects and tasks and roles to play. One of the best ones I see, there's often a coming of age ritual when kids are somewhere between the age of 11 and 14, where they start to join family meetings and have age appropriate conversations. There's going to be a lot of things that go over their head, but the kids are often tasked with planning the annual vacation, managing the budget, understanding how many people we have to get from one place to another, how many days we can go for, how many airfares that is, et cetera. And it becomes a great learning tool. You're teaching the values of the family. You're teaching great skills and life skills. And we often try and pair, I say we, but this is sort of a framework, the grandparents with the rising generation to do those projects together. You skip a generation. It's amazing to get grandparents together with the young kids to embark on some of these projects or to plan some of the activities that we're going to do when we get together for the annual family retreat. And so kids start taking responsibility to deliver great experiences, to manage money within budget, to build all sorts of great things for the family enterprise. And so by the time they ultimately come of age as young adults, they know that they may ultimately be a director or a family council member or a steward of some kind in the future when there is succession at the board level. But it's not a conversation about saying, well, my brothers and sisters and I are going to divide this up when the ultimate happens and go our separate ways. So it's really an intentional decision to say, we'd like to keep this together. No one really owns it. We're putting the wealth into an entity, whether it's a trust or a family office, or even just in principle, we're saying we're stewarding this for the next generation rather than dividing it up. The other thing I'll say, Chris, just really quickly on raising great kids, when I first embarked on learning about all of this in my 20s, I was really concerned that my kids naturally were going to grow up around a whole lot more wealth and abundance and opportunity than I did. And I didn't have a bad upbringing in the slightest. I came from a wonderful middle-class family and had lots of experiences. But by definition, we're wealthy. And there's things that I want to do in my life. And my kids have to come with me, right? Because they're young kids. And so I don't want to not live my own life with fear that I'm going to spoil my kids. And how do you reconcile these things? And so, one of the greatest conversations I had on this topic was with a guy called Jim Shields, who talks about, in part, how to raise great kids and this concept of 18 summers. And so as a family, we've adopted that as one of our value system, 18 summers. You only get 18 summers with your kids. before they go off to college or they're young adults and they start their own life. At most, 18 summers. When you think about it in that context, and then you think about how old your kids already are, you go, wow, I've already missed some, or I've only got a few left. What am I going to do to make these amazing? And so we've sort of architected our life in a way where we work very, very hard during the school term. And then on the holidays, we try and spend a great deal of time with our kids and also create amazing experiences. If there's only 18 summers, how are you going to remember them? And as I said earlier in the conversation, where we aspire to be global citizens, we love to travel. So we try and expose our kids to incredible travel experiences and cultures around the world with our wealth. So we're not hiding the wealth. We're not trying to pretend it's not there, but instead we're trying to give them worldly experience rather than stuff. So that could be a safari in Africa. It could be, hiking in Cambodia. It could be skiing Aspen. It could be exploring, the ancient parts of Europe. But when the kids go on those adventures, they learn 10 words of the language. They understand the different currencies. They're given a little budget to manage, and they have to buy their ice cream with that local currency and say hello and please and thank you to the people that they're dealing with in Spanish or some other language. And so it just becomes a way of operating as a family, creating amazing experiences rather than stuff.
I want to be part of your family. Can I be your kid?
Come and join us.
How old are your kids?
My kids are 6 and 3.
So here's an interesting question. If you're the founding family, and I'm in we're very, very similar. My folks were middle class, great upbringing. There were times we were poorer than others, but overall, I was not poor growing up.
Yep.
Do you include your parents as part of the family meeting, or does it start with you since you're resetting the culture?
That's such a good question. It depends. In our circumstances, we haven't.
Okay.
Not because it's impossible to do so, but it's very difficult.
Okay.
Part of the story that I lived as being an entrepreneur and not coming from a business family was that I clashed with my parents quite a bit as a young adult. And when I went to university, I told the fun story about running the party hire company, but really it stressed my parents out. I wanted to drop out of uni every other day. They wanted me to stay there because, a good quality education is everything. And my parents, wonderful, loved them to bits, but they were operating from their value system that they had inherited, which was a legacy in itself. My grandfather was adamant that his children and grandchildren would get an opportunity to be educated. That didn't work out so much, but my father inherited that, and all he ever wanted was to ensure that his sons, my brother and I, achieved a tertiary education. Right, that was his goal in life. It was so important to he and mum that was their culture. They've done an amazing job stewarding the next generation, if I use my own language, that if they can get their kids through and well-educated and tertiary education, because they didn't have necessarily the same opportunities. But he then was from the generation where he got himself an education and then got a good, safe government job and worked in it for 45 years. And there was times, many, many times throughout those 45 years when he was miserable. I remember it growing up. Dad did not like going to work. He was not inspired and on fire and passionate about it. In his last sort of 5 to 10 years, he found some, a new role and some passion and came alive and loved it, which was wonderful to see. But, to me, I didn't understand it. I was wired like an entrepreneur. I was saying, if you don't love it, go and do something else. Go and create something. Go and build something. And of course, I had to, in a sense, rebel away from family to go and build my story. And then after I achieved some success and de-risked myself and my own family, now we have a much stronger relationship and understanding between us, because really what they were just saying is, we're worried about you. We don't want you to fail. We don't want you, we want you to get a good education and a great job. Whereas I said, I never want to work for anyone. That doesn't make sense to me. I'm put on this earth to build stuff. And so because of that difference in value system and the amount of growth I've gone on to sort of move away from and build new things, including values and understanding, we've chosen not to include the prior gen in our enterprise. For us, the founding generation is us and starts from here, sort of a fresh line in the sand. But what we do, final comment on this, is we share some of the incredible storytelling and examples from prior generations with our kids now. Right? So we document where we came from. We're not saying that we're rejecting everything prior to us, not at all. We're saying this is what we've learned from, this is what we've come through, these are the trials and tribulations that your elders have been through, and this is what's brought us the circumstances that we have today.
It's fascinating. And to be fair, if I had been your parent and you started Fishy Fitness, I might have been worried that you would be a failure too. I'm totally kidding. You know what? I'm kidding.
They still have absolutely no idea what I do, but I seem to do it well. So we just choose not to understand each other sometimes and enjoy the grandkids together.
It really is so scary how similar some of our stories are. I was very rebellious in high school. I left high school a year early to go to college because I wanted to get out of the house and be my own person.
Yep.
And looking back on it, you can reflect on it as just a misunderstanding of, them trying to be a parent and me thinking it was just a misunderstanding of values, not in a bad way, not that theirs were bad and mine were right, but just different. So it's interesting to hear that. Okay, to wrap up the topic on just like kids in the second generation, and I think we've covered a lot of it, but if you want to guarantee that the second generation is not going to be set up for success, is the answer that you treat those kids as entitled kids they were born on third base and they are going to live a life that just because they were born, they hit the lottery? Is that how you damage it? Or are there other ways to screw it up unintentionally?
I love it. There's so many ways to screw it up, Chris.
Yeah.
Look, if you treat the kids as entitled because they are entitled, then the behavior follows that. So when the kids, cry that they need the new toy or the new thing or the new whatever, and they take that into school, high school environments, and they constantly want to peacock, right? They want to be the biggest, the best, the flashiest. And it might be that they got a cell phone before someone else, or they got an iPad, or they got something else, and constantly they're showing off how they're better because they've always been told that they're better. I'm on third base, I'm a princess, I'm a prince, I've always been taken care of. Daddy, granddaddy, grandma, they always look after me. I get what I want if I cry. And of course, if that's the way you behave, if that's the way you parent, you're going to raise kids that are entitled and have expectation and have absolutely no idea how to strive or achieve things on their own.
Yep.
And so, all of the research around wealth and raising great kids is really not about the wealth. You can raise kids, great kids, amid enormous amounts of wealth. It's whether or not you're there as a parent, right? There are wealthy families out there that made all of their wealth in the absence of parenting. The kids are raised exclusively by the help, and there's nothing wrong with having help, but it raised exclusively by the help. They get to a young adult age. They've never had the value system or the experiences passed down, and then wonder why their kids didn't turn out the way they wanted them to. I think wealth is an amplifier, as we said earlier. It can amplify the good or the bad. So what do you want to teach?
Yep.
And I think the earlier you start to teach those lessons, the better. I think the best way to teach it is with experiences. And that doesn't mean shying away from wealth, but I would err towards transparency, helping to understand that there is wealth, and then engaging the kids on conversation to say, well, what do we do with it? This is our financial capital, but what about our impact? What about our social capital? What about our human capital? What's important to us spiritually? Where are we going to invest this financial capital to the benefit of the next generation and beyond? That's a better question, I think.
Yep. Okay. Again, I'm just going to keep peppering you. It's just amazing. Have you seen it? And we kind of discussed this, but let's just say you got 2, 3, 4 kids. 3 of them are great, and one of them is just a total pill. Just, not productive in society, maybe, on drugs, who knows what it is, but just really not following the course. How have you seen families handle that? It's not even about who's going to succeed the business, but to kind of build that plan when you have such an outlier that can in a lot of cases gobble up all the attention in the family. What do great family business, the business of family, what do they do with folks like that in the family? Do they care for them more and love them more? Do they let them fail and hit their head and hopefully come back? Like how is that designed?
Look, another great question. And you're talking about two things here. One is the family's human capital. The other part of it I see is generational resiliency. How do we not have the black sheep or the, and it's not always a black sheep, but how do we not have the difficult circumstances bring down the rest of the family legacy that we're trying to create? So in the first part, let me address it from the positive. There's oftentimes where there is an inheritor or a next generation member who is incapable of being a participant in the family enterprise. It could be because they've gone off the rails, they're on drugs, they're in jail, otherwise, or it could be because they aren't intellectually capable. They might be physically disabled. They might be intellectually disabled. There might be other reasons that they can't fully participate. And that happens in just about every family. It's not rare, particularly as families grow quickly. I think the family then comes together to decide, well, what are we going to do to support that person? Remembering that wealth amplifies. So if you've got a negative where someone maybe has grown up with abundant wealth, entitlement, whatever, and has gone off and used that wealth for drugs and other things because they can't find their purpose in life, because they have other pains in their life, cutting off the wealth is usually a good first move. We want to cut off the amplifier. Again, I'm not qualified to speak on this topic. I'm only speaking from experience of talking to families who have struggled to manage it. This stuff is not easy. But typically, if you're in an environment where you're talking about stewardship, those people are not on the family council because they can't contribute to the extent, and they're not elected to the family council. Usually it's the wider family group, the wider shareholders, the entire family tree that votes on who's going to represent us and steward us from a council perspective. So those people typically don't make it there anyway, which helps. For those that need a bit of extra help and support, when we're talking about how we're going to invest in and support the human capital of the next generation, families often set aside a pool of capital and specifically set up a trust or a similar structure just to meet the future needs of that adult who perhaps needs support or in-home care or similar for the rest of their lives. And so rather than waiting until the founders pass away and the second generation says, okay, there's 4 siblings, but one isn't fully able, how are we going to divide up the wealth? Instead, you're better off making that decision while everyone's still around. The founding generation says, right, we're going to set aside this pool of financial capital into a trust to take care of their future needs. And they don't necessarily participate in further inheritance because the remaining 3 siblings aren't really inheriting either. They're on the council, they're stewarding it, they're going to pass it to their grandkids. It's more about making sure that the care is taken care of, whether it's healthcare or otherwise. And we see the same things in education. So a lot of families will dictate an education policy and what that means, what they'll pay for and what they won't. I want to talk really quickly about generational resiliency because you talked about what happens when these things go wrong. Another great example is what happens when divorce or separation takes place. So we've got great wealth at the founding generation. Second generation, there's 4 adult children, and one of those children goes through a divorce after 20 years. No one saw it coming, but it happens, and it happens all the time. How do we protect the family's capital, the family enterprise, when that one marital issue takes place? And how do we protect the estate? And so a lot of families that govern intentionally to protect these 5 capitals that I talked about before also have a lot of policies in place before they ever need them. One is, who is a family member? So if a spouse marries into a family enterprise, are they considered a family member? Do they get to vote? Do they get to inherit? Do they have those sorts of rights to participate? Are they allowed to participate on the family council? Is it bloodline, descendants, or otherwise? And then also protective policies. What happens when something goes wrong? So, I've spoken to some families who have a trigger that takes place where families actually sign an agreement, and I'm talking about adult married children here, sign an agreement that says if I or my spouse moves out of the marital home for more than 2 nights in a row for any reason, because we're having an argument or otherwise, I must immediately resign from the family council, the enterprise directorships of any operating companies, and distance myself from the family's wealth. Because there is enormous risk, and of course, different laws, different parts of the world, but the whole mechanism is designed as protective. How do we protect the family's legacy? How do we protect the family's capital and keep it together while supporting this one child or child plus spouse working through their issues? And so having insurance policies in place, protective policies in place, funds set aside for healthcare, education, all those things is part of a family planning for generations. And that also means planning for when things go wrong and ensuring that you survive those hits.
How important is it that whether it's the founding, let's just, again, we've kind of spent this conversation on founding and second generation. Maybe we'll do one next year on second to third and get more into the weeds there. But how important is it that the founding patriarch and matriarch are aligned and love each other? And is it even possible to do this if the two people at the top aren't even in cahoots?
It's very challenging if they're not. It's very challenging to build a family enterprise if the two people at the top are not aligned. What usually takes place is it either falls apart or you build an enterprise, not a family enterprise.
Yeah.
So, if you've got a patriarch who's the founder and the matriarch's not involved or not on board or don't get along, one way to think of that is that the founding generation has already been pruned. We talked about pruning the family tree branches and things like that. If there's only one person passing the wealth down, it doesn't really help much because it was usually only one group to begin with in the founding generation. But oftentimes it does segment the next generation who picks sides, and that can cause a great deal of damage. What often happens in that space is that the wealth is liquidated and it's divided up because, if you've had a separation in the founding generation,
yep,
and there's an enormous amount of wealth passed down to the next generation, but half the camp sides with mum and half the sides with dad. There is very little way to bring even the next generation together, unless it's a small miracle, to want to govern and keep it together the same way.
Okay. All right, we're going to spend the last segment on it is now time to put your kids, or let's say they're getting out of college, and we're going to kind of break it up into two ways. And now they are interested in the business. Everything that you've done as a parent up to that point has worked. What are the best practices for starting to introduce them into the business? Whereas we know if your kids were trying to join Vroom Vroom right now with 200 employees, and they're all those employees are all of a sudden going, well, we thought we might be CEO one day, but that dream's over. At the same time, you don't want your kids to enter. They're going to already be kind of, they're going to have a little bit on their back, right? They're Mike's son or daughter.
On.
How do we get them in the business? What are the best practices? And is that letting the company know ahead of time, I'm running in a business that there is a chance that this happens? Do you let the company know that early, or do you not, so that maybe it never happens and you shouldn't have said anything to begin with? I know I just asked a lot there, but I think you know where I'm headed.
Yeah. So on the final point, surprise is the enemy, right? So we avoid surprise at all costs. That's in the operating company. It's also in the family.
Okay.
The real answer, and that I've seen this played out in most very large family enterprises, is kids graduate from college. It's been successful so far. They're well aligned. They may have an interest in participating in the enterprise somehow. It could be one operating business. We'll use that example. Best thing to do is say no. Turn them away. Because the family has an existing policy that they put in place before need. Remember, we talked about this before. We've already defined who is a family member, what are they entitled to, what do they get to do. We've talked about what happens if someone gets separated or divorced. We also have a policy about who is a family member and who gets the right to work in a family business or to work in an operating business that the family stewards? And under what circumstances do they get that right? Is it automatically entitled? Do they graduate college, come in, and they're immediately, COO and pushing the prior generation out the door? No. Typically, the policy around who gets to work in the business is very strict, very structured, and in place ahead of need before someone reaches that age. The policy usually states you're not allowed to apply for a role in the family business until you've had at least 5 or 10 years of outside experience working for other people. 1 or 2 of those years must be experience overseas. And only to that extent can you then come back and apply for an open position at the family business if it is open. And the recruitment process will either be run by a third-party recruitment firm with no bias, or it will be run by a member of a branch of the family who are your uncles, aunts, or cousins, and you will be interviewed through that process, and your parents not allowed to be involved. And if you beat out the market in terms of third parties for that role, and you're the most qualified and most experienced and best person for the role, then you're welcome to work for the family business.
I think I know what your answer to this is going to be. I think you might have just answered it. But if let's say both of your kids are very interested to come work for you, does it happen often where in the family, and again, different cultures, different religions, like you mentioned, or, in one culture, it's the oldest son and his life is kind of predetermined. But in a situation where that's not the case, and you have multiple kids that feel qualified, and maybe both of them want the top spot one day, have you seen tactics that work there? And is it what you just said, where it's run very with a non-biased third party? What happens when there's multiple kids that want a piece of the action and maybe each other's action?
Look, I think you should aspire to build something big enough so that multiple kids can have a piece of the action, but they're different pieces. I've seen a lot of families that have developed 4 or 5 operating businesses and decided that they want one child to head up each rather than competing for the same one. So they give them a different division or a different geography or a different whatever. Of course, different kids have different skill sets and interests. So it would be rare that you have 2 siblings who are equally qualified for the job. It doesn't mean that 2 or 3 don't think that they're entitled. If we're watching Succession on TV and we think, everyone wants the top job. Well, not everyone has equal experience and the capability. But when that happens, typically, from my perspective, I want to create enough opportunity that there's opportunity for everyone across the group and not have it just be one operating business, because that's part of generational resiliency, diversifying our wealth in different geographies, different industries, different ways of making money, but also providing lots of opportunity for the kids to explore their passion skill sets because there is lots of things going on. There could be someone that wants to manage the wealth in the family office. I see this a lot. Often one time there'll be a very financially or numbers astute child that gravitates towards managing money, managing investments, managing the family office. And then there'll be someone that's maybe, naturally has the gravitas and is a natural leader and is better aligned to succession. And that plays out quite a bit as well. In the event that you really do have a clash and a competition for the top job, same thing. Policies are in place before need, external recruitment, other votes from wider family members, and those decisions are binding.
This has been an incredible conversation. I'll end it on this question, but what all this sounds amazing, and people can listen to your podcast. But if they've made it to this point and now they're interested, going, I really want to set something up, and I don't quite know how to do it. Is this just something you Google? Like, what would be your recommendation for how people could go about a healthy process to set this up for their family?
Look, I like the question because it's exactly the question that I asked myself, right? I was a founding generation. I made wealth in my 20s, and I looked around for role models and examples, and I couldn't find them. It's not that they weren't there, but they weren't in my immediate network and my realm, and how do I find this? And so part of the reason why the Business of Family exists is because I set out to create the content and the conversations which I was looking for and couldn't find.
Yep.
So, not to plug my thing, but I created that to fill a need that I couldn't find myself. Since then, I've connected with some wonderful advisors and authors of books and others. And I mentioned earlier the Jay Hughes book, Family Wealth. I think it's a great book. It's been around for decades. The principles are timeless, and learning about the concept of these 5 capitals, learning about the concept of stewardship, I think is a great place to start, because really what we're talking about here isn't rocket science. Anyone can, or any family can choose to do it, but you do need to put in work and you need to do it with intention. This doesn't happen by luck. So, definitely find some resources, seek out some role models that have done it before, and then get ready to actually do the work. And this suits business people and entrepreneurs quite well, because we use a lot of the same frameworks in family governance as we do corporate governance.
Yeah.
We talk about the concept of a board. We talk about the concept of separating ownership and control. We talk about shared decision making. We talk about having a vision statement and a set of core values and operating within them. Talk about hiring the best talent, reinvesting for growth, protecting our risks. How do we become an enduring enterprise or an enduring family? How do we tell our stories from years gone by to the next generation or the next set of employees that are coming into the enterprise? How do we keep that spirit alive? These are all the same concepts applied to family. And I talk about it as a founder, but I've interviewed families that are 14 generations old, and you just go, wow, how do they do that? So it's not that there aren't role models in the world. You can find them if you're looking for them. And I think it's a wonderful place to start.
This has been incredible. If people want to find you and see the work that you've done, how can people get in touch?
Look for the Business of Family podcast on your favorite player, or the businessoffamily.net, or find me on Twitter at Mike Boyd. I'd love to connect with people in the audience. And, I often get some great questions thrown at me, and it's always a challenge to try and respond in 140 or 280 characters. And I love the brevity of Twitter, but it's a bit challenging sometimes.
Well, if Elon Musk has his way, maybe it'll become 480 characters. Who knows?
Yeah, I think so. Who knows? By the time this is published, it might be a completely different circumstance.
Yeah. Mike, thanks so much. This was incredible.
Absolutely my pleasure, Chris. Thanks again for having me.